All right. Welcome to WireWheel's Privacy Rollup, weekly recap of newsworthy privacy updates from the previous week. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in and introduce you to our weekly featured guest, WireWheel CPO Rick Buck. Good morning, Rick. Hope all is well with you.
Hey, Earl, how are you? And thanks for putting this together.
Appreciate you taking the time to connect with me today. Looks like we've had quite the week last week. Let's kick off today's conversation with what's going on with Alaska's Consumer Data Privacy Act, including the similarities with California's CCPA.
Yeah, this has been an interesting couple of weeks in general. There's been a proliferation of state privacy laws that have been introduced over the last couple of months. California, as we all know, kicked the whole thing off. CCA has been passed. Its amended version, the CPRA, has been passed, and as a result, states like Virginia, Washington, and many others have introduced new laws. The most recent of which that was introduced was last week, which was Alaska. They did a combined bill between their House and their Senate. It looks a lot like CCPA in that it has rights and it has qualifications for what businesses are. But like most of the other state laws that have been modeled around CCPA, there are a lot of things about it that are different. So let me talk a little bit about some of the similarities and some of the differences.
Please.
First, who does it cover? It covers businesses with $25 million of annual revenue. Check, that's like CCPA.
Mm-hmm.
It covers people who purchase or disclose the information of 100,000 consumers or household devices. Check, that matches CPRA. CCPA was 50,000, it got bumped to 100. But here's where there's an interesting difference. It also includes the definition of companies that have sold information of a consumer or household device of even just one customer, of one consumer. So very restrictive on the implications of who's in scope of this. And so many people are already fretting that this is going to be a very business unfriendly kind of law. So we'll see how that all comes to pass. In terms of who else is covered, the law has while it's more restrictive from who's in scope, it's a little bit wider in terms of who the protected entities are. The protected entity would be the consumer. And in the Alaska law, it calls out to people Alaskans who are physically present in the state and intend to remain indefinitely in the state. So an interesting choice of words, but it means it only applies to people who are actually in Alaska, versus California and the other states applies to California state residents, regardless of where they live. So we'll see how that plays out. Again, newly introduced, this has not been passed. There's going to be lots of deliberation on how this bill ends up, and if it does pass, but these are the moving parts as we see them so far. In terms of rights, like California, there's a right to know, there's a right to access, there's a right to delete, there's a right to opt out of sales, there's a right to not have lesser services if you don't opt in. What it doesn't have is a right to correct, and it doesn't have a right to opt out of sharing personal information for behavioral advertising. So interesting there. It does have a private right of action in some specific cases, but that's still being defined. But interestingly enough, unlike the other state laws, its look back period is 5 years versus 12 months. So it would be a look back period from roughly 23 back 5 years. Versus, like California, a 12-year look back. So we'll see how that plays out. One of the other things that's different than CCPA is that while there is a deletion right, it comes with some extra burdens on businesses. Businesses need to, within 45 days, provide written documentation that deletion has been honored. The deletion request has been honored. So businesses are going to have to do a little bit of extra work when it comes to deletions. From an opt-out point of view, like California, there's going to be a do not sell my personal information button, but that button also is going to have to say do not sell or collect my personal information. And so what's interesting there is that it would imply that you need to opt in for the collection of names, but the only reference to the collection of data in the regs so far are on this button. So very unclear what the intention is there and what the implications are going to be there. From a geolocation point of view, businesses are going to have to limit their use and disclosure of precise geolocation. And so you will need to have people, A, need to tell people what you're doing with it, and B, give people an opportunity to opt out of using precise geo. They've changed the definition of minor from 16 to 18, which is older than most states. And you won't be able to use their information for marketing purposes unless, of course, you have the consent of the minor's parent or guardian. What else is similar or different? Those are probably some of the biggest differences. If you're a data broker, there's going to be some more restrictive language about data brokers and having to register with the state of Alaska. So that'll be interesting to see where that goes. It's going to be governed by the Alaska Attorney General. And of course, it'll have a private right of action. Again, all new news, lots to discuss. I know that the industry buzz is that this is a more restrictive bill than maybe some of the other states. So we'll see where this one ends up, and we'll see how many more bills get introduced between now and the next couple weeks and months.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see how this all plays out. One, does the pressure from all of the state bills up back to Washington, lead us to an inevitable federal legislation? Yet to be seen. But it will be interesting to see how all this plays out.
Agree. And, to really see what the influences are from state level and federal or state to state. A lot to really take in there. Thank you, Rick. Let's segue over to the Facebook privacy label on Apple's App Store, which discloses what kind of user data and how it's being used across third-party ads, marketing, analytics, and personalization. When you take a look at the label, it's impractically long and somewhat intimidating. Would you agree?
It is intimidating, and it's a little confusing, which is the bad news. The good news is that people are starting to think about a privacy label. I love that concept. Mm-hmm. I applaud Apple for throwing out the first gauntlet on that. I'm applauding Facebook for jumping on the train. There are lots of politics about what ulterior motives of these companies are for doing these kinds of things. But at face value, having a labeling system, I think, is a great idea, and I'm hoping to see a lot more adoption on it. A couple things. Let me talk about that, though. In terms of making this a better experience for users and making it less confusing, a couple things need to come into play. One of which, there's this concept of ubiquity, right? It needs to be not just Facebook and Apple putting labels on things, but it needs to be the entire app community. It needs to be the entire advertising community honoring these things, looking for these things. One, there needs to be ubiquity that they're being published. And two, there needs to be a really strong understanding and confidence level on the consumer side to know where to look for these labels, to know what the labels mean, and for them to have confidence that the labels have a correlation to their notice and choice, and it actually empowers them to be able to make decisions about how their data is being used.
Yeah, so I guess in a way, building the trust economy on the back end between advertisers, networks, and all that stuff, it will help build the trust economy within the consumer and the businesses themselves, right?
Exactly. Yep.
Thank you. And to that point, I hope that we can get to a point where we as users can be more empowered to take action on these privacy labels.
Yeah, I think kind of dovetails with my first answer. I think what we will need to see much like I was just talking about with the state laws, where it'll be interesting to see how it plays out with, potentially having a dozen or so individual state laws that all look kind of the same, but all have a lot of differences. We need to come up with a way in which this, again, I use the word ubiquitous, but that this becomes ubiquitous, that this is that the data labeling is something that's easily accessible, that's easy to understand, that has a consistent format, and that's managed, and I'm not suggesting one way or the other, but it's managed either as a federal program or an industry best standard or something that's got some uniform consistency to it. And I'm not picking either of those or any of those as a choice, but there needs to be some uniformity across all that. And it needs to be widely adopted by the industry, and it needs to be widely understood that it's a tool for consumers to rely on.
I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you so much for these updates, Rick.
You're welcome.
Thank you to everybody tuning in to WireWheel's Privacy Rollup. If you'd like to reach out to us and present any privacy questions, please reach out to us at marketing@wirewheel.io. Check back with us again next week for more updates. Bye now.
Great. Thanks everybody for listening. See you next week.